Now we're going to talk about the general idea of bonded particle modeling, okay? And notice I'm saying bonded particle modeling and the PFC model. And what we're going to find out is I'm going to define the PFC model as all potential microstructural things you could construct in PFC. And I'm going to argue that that is an unbelievably large parameter space. And that's only just begun to be explored by people. There's so many variations one could do. Just the example we just did, adding the cement in this interesting way with these chains, right? That's a whole different microstructure, and that's going to behave very differently than any previous PFC model, right? So we're going to talk about at the high level some of these ideas, and then we're going to have another description of what we call this material modeling support package. This is a well-defined and documented set of fish functions that provide what I call an environment such that you can create different types of bonded materials, and then you can do tests on them: direct tension, Brazilian, and triaxial. Okay. And basically it's going to have all the support. You're going to effectively just start with something and you're going to set parameters, and then you're just going to let it run, and it's going to do all these things, and it's going to create the material and make a save files, and then it's going to let you do these different tests, and it'll have save files along the way and make stress strain curves and all that. So you don't have to do all this from scratch. Okay. So that's where we're going today, is to go through that material. So BPM lectures, here we go. So what's the goal? We want to be able to create a synthetic bonded material, and we want to be able to do rock mechanics tests on it, right? So there's my picture of a little sandstone I have in my office. And there's my pocket knife for scale. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to build a dense sandstone to begin with, like this. And then we're going to go and measure its properties, macro properties, and then we're going to say, okay, let's go back and let's reduce the amount of cement at the microstructural level, and let's see what happens, right? Or let's put in pores and let's see what happens, etc. Stuff like that. Because these models are always simplifications of the true microstructure, right? We have to do calibration. Okay. And what is calibration? Calibration means take your model with its parameters, all of its parameters, and end up basically doing some comparisons of the behavior in such a way that you can choose a set of parameters to match what you think are the important things that need to be matched. Okay. We are going to what we're trying to, so then the question is, what are you trying to calibrate towards? What are you trying to match? So when we build synthetic rock, what we say is, well, it's important to match the UCS, unconfined compressive strength. It's important to match the modulus and perhaps the Poisson ratio. It's also important to match the triaxial response, which is telling you how the rock responds to confinement, how much it gets strengthened by confinement. And don't forget the tensile strength of the rock, because the tensile strength is a very important thing that ultimately is governing. That's usually, in almost all cases, it's the tensile, it's micro tensile cracks that form in rock, even under compressive loading. And so the tensile strength is an important thing. Those are the things we typically would say we want to calibrate towards. Notice something I didn't say. One of the other things you could, in principle, you could try to calibrate to match any macroscopic property of rock. So one of the things you might say is, well, fracture toughness. For those of you that know about fracture mechanics, there's a concept called fracture toughness, which relates to how does a material get weakened when you actually have a well-defined large fracture in there. We typically do not calibrate towards fracture toughness. We're going to find out that the fracture toughness is going to actually be dependent upon the particle size. And as the particle size gets made smaller, the fracture toughness gets lower. We're going to find also that those other properties I talked about, tensile strength, UCS, triaxial, those properties we are going to find are independent of particle size. So we're going to be able to make a material at a certain particle size in a vessel and measure its properties. And then we're going to say, run it again with particles half that size. And we're going to get approximately the same macroscopic properties. The difference there is, we think, partly because for those initial fracture, for those rock mechanics tests that I described, we have a uniform stress field throughout the whole specimen. When we do a direct tension test, we have uniform tension. When we do a UCS, we have uniform compression. When you do a fracture toughness test, now you have very large gradients of stress. And those gradients of stress seem to be an important thing that are getting affected by the particle size. Now we'll talk about all this much more when we get to those parts, but I'm giving you the high level picture of things. Okay. So this is an ambitious goal, but it is achievable. So let's get started. So first of all, so you can think of these bonded particle modeling lectures as a whole entirely different set of things. Everything we've talked about so far is simply background, and everything we've talked about is basic uses of PFC, basic behaviors of granular systems, whether with PFC or with any other code that's distinct element. Now we're talking about, let's apply this to this methodology that was defined by Peter Kundal and myself back in 2004. And let's talk about, if we bond these things together, how they behave. Okay, this is the stuff that is been developed by us and is in PFC, and you have support to do it. This is the type of stuff that's not in any of these other discrete element codes. The PFC code itself is just an engine, but there's all these fish functions we've developed, this material modeling support package that's allowing you to basically create these bonded systems in a rational way and to test them. Okay. As I mentioned before, I taught a graduate course called Micromechanical Modeling using discrete elements a long time ago when I was a professor in Toronto. And all of the different materials for that course you have. The syllabus, the final exam with the solution, because when I gave the exam, it was actually like a 3-hour thing where there were like 6 questions, and then you had to write an essay to answer them. And so, and they were like, kind of important fundamental questions. How do you defend your bonded particle material if someone in the outside world looks at it and says, what the hell, how does this relate to reality? And I also, so that you have the exam, but then I also wrote like a page or so of each one, an answer to these different questions. And so you might find that of interest, and if you want to look at that. We're not going to talk about that in detail. And then, as I had mentioned earlier, there are these lecture notes, and they cover all these different aspects of discrete elements and bonded particle modeling. Here, creating a biaxial cell. That's essentially some of the stuff we did, right? Talk about damping, talk about time step determination, talk about calibrating a material, right? Okay. Whoops, what happened there? Slideshow, there we go. And then this papers of interest, actually, this is just a set of references of journal papers. And these are essentially my take of kind of the evolution of this type of bonded particle modeling. It's a focus on bonded particle modeling. So we talk about basically the original paper by Kundal and Strack that describes the distinct element method itself, but all of that was for unbonded systems. And so you could think of that, it behaves like a cohesionless granular material. And then this Potyondy and Kundal, which is called the bonded particle model for rock, basically now says, let's include bonding. This is the result of essentially, remember when I said I started at ITASCA 1998, 1997 or so, and Peter Kundal says, hey, I've started playing around with these things and putting in cement, putting in bonding, and it looks like it's an interesting system. I don't think it's going to be quantitatively at all like rock, but I think it's just going to be Hollywood graphics. But let's explore this. And it turns out it is very much like rock. So these are called bonded particle models. And then there's an evolution of different things that have been done along the way, where and in each of these papers then talks about that. Okay. So that's something that may be of interest. And all of these papers listed in here are also, you have them, they're all PDFs of these different papers. Okay. So let's go. And then, so again, so for the BPM lectures, these are all lectures. These are all hour to hour and a half long lectures that talk about different aspects of bonded particle modeling. Don't worry, we're not going to cover them all, but you have them all. And I'll point out some of these things, and they may be, you may find them to be of interest to go and look at that. Okay. And these are all the links, right? Click, that's going to take you to where that paper is. So what we're going to talk about here are these top two, right? This is an overall talk about bonded particle modeling in general and how it can be applied to do rock mechanics research. And then we're going to talk about this set of fish functions called material modeling support. Okay. And we'll mention some of these other things as we go. I think probably at some point I want to maybe go through this talk, especially because Toe is here. This was that work that was done in 2014 or so for BP, the oil company, where we looked at could we model perforation damage with PFC material. And we found a lot of very, very useful, interesting things from that work. And I think you will find that interesting. So I'd probably go through that talk at some point tomorrow. Okay. All right, let's get started. BPM lectures, talks. Here we go. BPM as a tool. All right. And you're also going to find that a number of things that are in here we have already touched on in small places throughout the previous lectures. Okay. So we're trying to give an overview of this type of modeling. This modeling is described. There's essentially two papers. There's the 2004 paper called the Bonded Particle Model for Rock. Then in 2015, I was asked to revisit these things. And as of that point, I gave a snapshot, current trends and future directions. And then here is this memo that describes that collection of fish functions that we use to do material modeling. Okay. This technical memo is like 85 pages. Okay, it's written in a very, I think, clear way and describes all these different aspects that you need to understand if you're going to do and use these things. Okay. So, and this talk is aimed at an even higher level audience. You don't necessarily have to understand rock mechanics fully to understand this. Okay. So let's do the overview of the talk. So, what's the basic idea of bonded particle modeling? And then we're going to take a little side pathway to talk about the actual physics of rock, okay, at the microstructural level. Because in the end, this modeling has to be defended by saying that we are capturing the essential features of the microstructural physics. So we're going to talk a little bit about this whole idea of brittle fracture, because we're talking about brittle fracture, stuff that happens up near the surface of the earth. We're not talking about deep underground where things are plastic-like, right? We're going to find that the brittle fracture process is actually fundamentally controlled by the nature of the pore space. And we're going to designate two different classes of rock. We're going to talk about compact rock, like a granite, and we're going to talk about porous rock, like a sandstone, okay? And then to try to get a better idea of what we mean by this bonded particle model, we're going to look at it and compare and contrast it with another model of rock, which would be a big elastic body with a whole bunch of cracks, which is would be LEFM. Instead of a bunch of an elastic body with a bunch of cracks, we have a bunch of grains with glue. Those are different ways of idealizing rock, but they're, as we will see, they are complementary to each other. So again, we're going to talk about then the bonded particle modeling, the whole methodology. We're going to talk about this idea of a PFC model, and I'm going to say we want to think about it in terms of, think of it like it's a synthetic material. It's like we could actually, because you could actually build such a thing in principle in the laboratory. And again, if you have a constitutive model with 17 constitutive parameters, you could not build such a material in a laboratory. There is no direct microstructural correspondence between a complicated stress strain constitutive model and a real material. Whereas with the PFC system, you actually do have, these components of things that actually are then interacting, and these components are relatively simple such that you could build that thing. We're then going to talk about the BPM and these different, and then I'm going to say different microstructural models, different sorts of ways you could bond these things together and add higher level features, different sorts of microstructures that could be built using this approach. Going to give an example of two different bonded particle models that we're going to see are going to be able to match the uniaxial compressive strength and the tensile strength. And then we'll conclude with some conclusions. So you've already seen this here. This is the poem that starts out the lecture. And I just want to read this thing, the whole idea: clues that spawn understanding arrived at by modeling, deliberate simplification, the kind that gives clarity. The key element here is simplification, right? This is from the Kundal and Starfield and Kundal paper, where they talk about the philosophy of modeling, right? And so the whole key is we want to do things as simple as possible. But in order to do that, we have to have the proper mechanisms, and the models need to be able to demonstrate those mechanisms. Here again is the basic idea. You have a rock mass. I'm going to say it's made up of, you start with intact rock and there's all kinds of joints that are added, right? There's two different scales at this thing. There's the microstructural scale, which is at the scale of the grains, and that's how we represent the intact rock. And then there's also this higher level scale where these joints, you can think of them as being overlaid upon that system. So, and again, now what we have is we have emergent phenomenon that occur, right? We build these microstructures. The intact rock can fracture and flow. The joints, I'm going to talk about the idea being they can rupture, they can break, basically the cohesion can break loose from the joints. And then of course they can slide. So we're mimicking these two things, and the idea is that the closer we can match the microstructural features and the structural features of the joints, the closer we can match those, the closer we're going to match the macroscopic behavior. With the whole idea, though, being that you don't want to put too much complexity in if you don't have to. So it all depends on what you're trying to get out of your models. You have to be guided by that. This is this idea then, right? We have this base material. Here's what you're seeing. There's this light greenish color. There's approximately 100 by 100 2D discs. And these discs have a slight size distribution such that when they pack, they do not form a crystalline packing. That's important. We then have this ability, which we'll talk about, to put in joints. And so that's what these green collections of contacts, they're going to behave like joints, like interfaces. And what you're going to see when we load this, we're going to do a compression test on this 1 meter square hunk of material with those joints, is that you're going to start to get breakage spanning between the joints, and then eventually the joints are going to rupture. The black is broken broken bond of the initial joint. The red and the blue are tensile and shear failures inside of the intact material. And I think, where is my, yeah, I do see. The problem is I can't see this thing because of this way we're showing this. Here we go. You've already seen this, I know, but now it should mean a little bit more. So we've been going, look at this. Look at this. We just talked about that. We're starting the test. We instantly started loading it. So there's this wave going back and forth a little bit. This is stress and strain that we're measuring. But you can see how it damps out. And now we're just pretty much going straight up, loading this thing up. Notice there were no breakages at this point. So this is probably okay. All right. We continue to load. We're going to start to see cracking in a moment. And let's see the first crack there. We started getting some cracking in the intact material at these two spots. Not enough cracking to have much of an effect on the stress strain curve, but it does. Notice how this is starting to be bumpy again. This is being bumpy because every time a crack forms, there's a redistribution of stress and there's a loss of stiffness. So this curve is slowly bending over. It's getting less and less stiff as more and more cracks form. In this case, the damage is acting right at the edge of the intact blocks. I don't see any damage going through here. That's not going to happen. But here it's starting to kind of localize along there, right? And now we're going to reach a point. This is going to fail because of rupture in one of the joints. That's going to be black. And I think watch this, I think it's going to rupture right around here, which will cause a very large drop in the stress strain curve. And notice this jumped across. That must have relieved enough stress that made this guy reach its critical point. And this now is starting to rupture along the joint. This is just beginning. Watch, this is going to continue to drop now. And there we go. So basically this thing started, it caused this to rupture, it caused this to rupture. Now we have a mechanism whereby the whole top half is going this way, the bottom half is going this way. We've effectively created at a macroscopic level a shear fracture in this system, right? And now, of course, it's not carrying as much stress. And I think we can, just because we can, you can see that process, right, going on as this thing is failing, right? So I'm demonstrating here the idea that we have intact rock, we have joints, we have damage in the intact rock, we have damage in the joints. The basic idea. This is a very simple model at its core. It has grains and it has bonds, and the damage is the bonds breaking. This is that system to try to illustrate all the different mechanisms. So this is again, about 100 by 100 yellow discs glued together. At the beginning, we carved out these circular holes. So that's our initial material. We're squeezing it. And the first thing that you notice is when you squeeze a heterogeneous cemented material, you end up generating microtensions. And that's the most important thing that happens in real rock and in real cemented material. And these are the sorts of reasons why. Here's my grains. I squeeze them. You start wedging these guys apart. If there's glue here, if there's a bond there, it's going in tension, right? This system is generating tension, right? This system here is generating tension at this location. Generating shear at the other 4 locations, but we're generating tension here. And so that means that because the microtensile, the tensile strength of rock is in almost all cases much lower than the shear strength, it's these locations that begin to break at the begin when you're compressing rock, which means then if you think of these broken things as micro cracks that are oriented perpendicular to the spring, you are creating all sorts of small micro cracks that are aligned with the sigma 1 direction. Okay. This is the key reason that this is making sense. And so in that previous slide, you should begin to understand. Remember, we have the blue is the compression between the surfaces. So because it's a cemented granular material, so many of the contacts, they started off with two surfaces pushing against each other. So some load is being carried, that's the blue. But then there's this cement material. So some load is also being carried in the cement. And so it's the cement that has the bonds. So that's why you're getting tensions like this. Those tensions are denoted as red in this picture. Black is compression in the cement, right? So this is the most important thing. You get this heterogeneous force transmission, which causes microtensions. That then leads to broken bonds that are magenta here, right? You're noticing because this crack is becoming like a fracture. That means as I'm pushing on it, this material here is unloading. Notice there's no thick lines anymore of compressive or tensile load anymore. There's still a little bit of load here. So this thing is unloading because it's become compliant. It's just naturally become compliant because of the cracking, right? Here's another crack. These extension fractures in this system, we have these stress concentrators because of these holes. And above and below the holes, if we're squeezing vertically, above and below the holes, we're getting sites of tension. And those sites of tension are higher than the tensions inside of here. And so that's why these guys start to crack. And that's why you're seeing everywhere these fractures emanating, these bonds breakages, which are turning into fractures, which are emanating from the holes. I'm going to try to use the term bond breakage means a single bond breakage. And then if these things tend to line up, then I'm going to call that a fracture. Okay. And also what we're seeing here is this, there's still confinement to this middle region. And so this guy is still carrying load, even though the outsides have begun to fail. Here you can see a column of compression, and this is going to buckle right here, and then that's going to go to zero. So if I run that, this is looking at the cracking, and this is this measured stress strain curve. You're going to see it goes out of there. You can see how it's coming out of those things. Notice it's still carrying load. This is loaded quasi-statically. So this is loaded very slowly. So we're giving time for all the stresses to redistribute. And so there's a lot of load paths here that this can keep on going to until it finally can't carry any more load. So again, if you look at that, right, notice that blip in the stress strain curve, right? And that's because this guy just formed, right? So that's the cracking, and this is the same system. And so thickness is magnitude, so you can see it's elastic still. Everything is just getting thicker and thicker, higher loads. Here's the compression getting transferred through the system. You can see the black and the blue predominantly. You can clearly see the tensile load that's developing above and below each hole. There's the stress strain curve. And now as we continue to go, we're going to see this thing. The stresses are going to begin to redistribute as this thing begins to fail. Here's that column that's left. Now it just broke. It formed a shear fracture there. And so you can see it's still carrying some load in the middle. That's why the stress strain curve hasn't completely gone to zero. You go far enough, it completely goes to zero, right? Now it's just a bunch of broken rubble getting pushed between the platens. Can't resist load anymore. All right. I mean, the reason that this model makes sense is because it exhibits these behaviors.